Hey guys, welcome to the Ad Astra podcast, the podcast where we integrate space, policy, and technology. I'm Jack.
And I'm Newton.
I have a Master's of Public Policy degree with a concentration in science and space policy.
And I'm a PhD in computer science and an all-around tech geek.
Okay guys, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Ad Astra Podcast, like us on Facebook, and subscribe to our mailing list on elemental.fm to get regular updates from the team. And if you would like what you hear, give us a review on iTunes and recommend us on Overcast.
Okay, and just like every week, a quick summary of what we'll go over today. We'll cover the latest from Washington, where we get into President Trump, a little bit about President Trump's speech, and as well as chat about the plans for the ISS after 2024. Then we'll hit the space news highlight of the week, where surprise, surprise, we're talking about SpaceX again.
Ooh, Elon's in the news again. My boy.
We'll have a few international updates, including the Ariane 5 launch facing delays after a general strike hits French Guiana. You guys may have heard of this. This is where the James Webb is going to be launched out of next year. So we figured we'd tackle a bit of that news, as well as highlighting ESA's Copernicus program and latest in tech. And coming soon to space, as always, we'll have what's coming up next within DC, a few DC events to share with you guys.
Yeah. So. And a new segment that we're sort of testing out at this point. I posted about it on my Facebook today, and on the Ad Astra Facebook. So make sure you follow us there.
And I will post it on my Facebook eventually.
Yeah, eventually you'll do it. But listener submitted queries, sort of trying to get a little bit more interactive with you guys. I know there's millions of you out there. I'm using Trump's numbers here, that want to get involved in the podcast. This is your way how. Just submit a question or comment or topic, and we'll pick one every week to cover. And first off today, we're going to talk about the latest from Washington. So sort of to wrap up what we talked about last week, the NASA authorization was signed into law. The only place a law or a bill can really go after it's signed by the president. And I'm going to echo something that Mr. Elon Musk said about the authorization, and that's meh. I mean, President Trump got to have his big, glory-filled moment surrounded by astronauts and senators and congressmen and the vice president, and sign this piece of legislation into law, which is a bit of a feat nowadays.
He even got his astronaut jacket.
Yeah, I know he got an astronaut. I don't have an astronaut jacket. He did. But there's all this pomp and circumstance around it, and it's a reauthorization. It doesn't really do much. And this is something that Senator Cruz, who also vied for this position of president, talked about, that this authorization's good, but there needs to be another one. Now, whether that next authorization is going to be in 2018 is yet to be seen. The main focus of this last reauthorization was to maintain the sort of the schedule of programs and the launch cadence for the next couple of years, because the last presidential transition we had from Bush to Obama, the NASA did not fare very well. Cancellation was canceled. Space Shuttle was canceled. And sort of we had to rely on the Russians for transport, which, especially in this day and age, not something you want to have to say.
Well, the Space Shuttle was set to only survive so long, and they just didn't do anything to sort of renew the Space Shuttle program. They just let it die, and for reasons of spending the money elsewhere, which.
Yeah, I mean, the Space Shuttle at a certain point, I mean, we passed this point with the ISS where the cost per year that you're spending on this program shifts from development of new technologies as the majority of your funds to just maintenance.
Yeah.
The ISS, this happened, I think, in 2014. The space shuttle, it was like in the 90s when it started to be like, okay, we're spending more money on maintaining them than we are on developing new technology for them. So you start to stagnate with programs as big as that.
Right.
So sort of to make sure that that didn't happen with this new administration, the folks on the Senate side, because they were the primary authors of the authorization, wanted to maintain our the cadence of and schedule of programs that we have,
Right.
which is good. I applaud them for that. But like for it to have as much pomp and circumstance, for people to ask me, people that we don't really talk space very often, but when we do talk space, I'm the guy they talk to. But then for them to be, oh, I saw NASA got a budget passed, and it's no, like you'd think
Not quite.
for as much pomp and circumstance there was, you'd think that a budget was passed.
Not quite.
But it wasn't. I mean, I'm gonna echo Musk here and say meh for the authorization. I mean, it's a great step. But there's a lot more that needs to be done. I think we really need to be focusing on appropriations. April 28th is right around the corner. And if we go into government shutdown mode, we don't have a space program. It's not deemed mission critical outside of some minor parts of the program, maintaining communication with the ISS and our satellite constellations. That's about it.
Yeah.
If we have a government shutdown.
I would, and I would say though, Elon Musk kind of sent out these feelings in a very presidential manner as tweets, and he talked about how the bill basically changes nothing, and saying that perhaps there will be some future bill that makes a difference for Mars, but this is not it. But I mean, the act does require NASA to create a detailed plan for human space exploration, culminating into that mission to Mars in the 2030s. But it just seems like he wants a little bit more out of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't blame him.
I want more out of it.
Yeah, I want more.
Like,
but also, like,
yeah.
its designated purpose was to make sure that the incoming administration didn't just gut everything the previous administration done and start at square one with our space program, and it succeeded in that. So I'll give it a meh in the overall scheme of space exploration and furthering human exploration of space. But like for its designated purpose, it succeeded. And
it
plus
served its purpose.
we get a cool new.
It just got really big news for a bill that just authorizes, continue to do what you're doing. That's effectively what the bill says. So
yeah, and I mean it's so big. I think NASA's 0.5% of the federal budget, and the weekly address. Trump's weekly address on Saturday was all about Apollo and NASA and our vision for the future and the James Webb Space Telescope, as he calls it. Awkward pauses and all. So we'll link that in the description or in the show notes.
Right.
But sort of back to the authorization, I think we really need to be focusing on the appropriations and for an upcoming authorization or Mars bill. I want them to find an acronym that spells out Mars so we can go to the Hill and say, vote yes on the Mars Act. Especially because Elon and Ted Cruz have talked before. SpaceX has their facility in Texas. Ted Cruz goes down there basically twice a year to view it and see all the progress they're making. So they are definitely talking, it seems. Their talking points are very, very similar, that we need another authorization or another bill or something. The one good thing that we do get out of this recent authorization is in less than 180 days, the administrator of NASA, which currently is the acting administrator, Robert Lightfoot, has to create a report on our progress for the journey to Mars. So we're going to get a cool report out of it. And then I think it's every 2 or 3 years we get another report after that. It's not like super frequently, but it's often enough. Or it could be even every 5 years. Someone correct me on this. I think it's every 5 years. But
Yeah, I'm not actually quite sure.
yeah. I mean, we'll link everything in the show notes below, everything that we're talking about here. Another thing to look forward to coming out of Washington around this authorization. It seems like the authorization happened, and now there's like these like 5 different tangential stories that are coming out of it. Of a new authorization, the appropriations coming up. Well, one of the things that we should be looking forward to coming out of Washington is the National Space Council and seeing how that is going to fare.
Right.
Newton, you and I talked about this a little earlier, that an NSC has not succeeded really since Apollo.
Right.
The last time it was tried was the late 80s, early 90s. I think starting in 89 with the
George Herbert Walker Bush.
Yeah,
The
Herbert
Elder
Walker Bush and his Space Exploration Initiative, which reestablished the Space Council, harkening back again to the days of Apollo, the days of yore, the Gilded Age of space exploration and American exceptionalism.
Well, maybe talk about what the original Space Council was, right?
Yeah. So in recent years, the way that the White House is organized is there's offices of policy areas. So there's an office of transportation policy, an office of commerce. There's like a bunch of different areas of policy. So there's an office of science and technology policy, OSTP, and was very prominent under the Obama administration for how active it was in influencing other areas of policy. Prior to that, to there being OSTP with a more staff-run policy shop, there was the National Space Council. There's various iterations. Every administration has a new phrase that they call whatever office of space and science is. But essentially, it's the National Space Council from the days of Apollo, which it consolidates all of the federal government's space activities, from NASA to NOAA to Department of Defense, consolidates them all into the Office of the Vice President. The last time we really saw this happen successfully, Apollo, Johnson started off as vice president, heading up the National Space Council. And I would probably say the one and only space cadet in chief that we ever had was Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Yep.
And he sort of set the framework for what the National Space Council was. And it consolidates the federal government's space activities into one council. Everybody gets a seat at the table, helmed by the vice president, who ultimately makes the decisions and paints with a very broad brush policy across the space agencies and administrations, within the federal government. Because there's not just NASA. I mean, NOAA has stuff. The FAA has a commercial space flight office.
Right.
DoD has a space budget that's comparable to NASA's. And then there's the Air Force. There's so many space programs within the federal government. There's not just NASA. And so what the Space Council would look to do is consolidate all of that underneath the vice president, which would be Mike Pence, which from what I hear is an avid fan of space exploration. Not something you would immediately peg him as being like one of his top issues, but space is very big for Pence. From Indiana, conservative Republican, very big into space. So that's something to see whether that succeeds or fails.
Part of the talk that I've been hearing about this is, one of the major things that it can do is, in some cases, get nearly direct funding for certain programs within NASA. That's kind of the excitement about it. It makes it allows NASA to give, to have very clear support for different programs within the administration. Now that can backfire in that it adds another layer of bureaucracy on top of on top of in an organization like NASA, because while the benefit is, this group gets to see deeply into NASA and see what's going on and help to appropriate funds, the detriment is also that they get to see directly into NASA and help to appropriate funds. Now they don't set completely the budget, but they can easily promote certain missions and things like that to be conducted. So that's just a kind of a layer to worry about, is that groups would have to be worried about pleasing this council, if you will.
Yeah. NASA, you must go before the council and subscribe to our ideals.
Yeah, and it's and it's like you said, there have been a lot of different iterations of this sort of thing. Back in 2016, an Apollo astronaut, Harrison Jack Schmidt, also weighed in on the prospect of a national space council and what it should be. But he's actually one of the astronauts that a few years ago proposed dismantling NASA completely and advocating for the creation of a new National Space Exploration Administration. And Jack, you'll actually love this quote from him. If the Trump administration pursues a vigorous and permanent deep space exploration program, one that looks at the moon as a necessary springboard to Mars, all that would be necessary would be to give the NASA administrator or new agency administrator full authority and necessary funding to implement that program. Jack, your thoughts?
We're going to talk about this later in our listener submitted queries. Yeah, we're going to talk about Moon versus Mars in a little bit. But
I figured I'd hand you that. But his real comments were about the NSC, were the bureaucracy issue too. Is that it kind of adds another layer on top of it. Which
you could also pronounce. I remember reading that article or reading an article about that proposal to form the new administration that's specifically for space exploration. Which that makes no sense to me, because really NASA is all about space exploration. And that, our planet is in space, if you didn't know that.
Yeah.
And
Whoa.
the avionics budget, the aeronautics budget, is like maybe $500 million. And it gets cut every year too. Like, NASA is a space agency. Like, you don't have to rebrand it or rename it. The NC or whatever, I feel like they're just trying to make it look close enough to NASA so that you can still say NASA. But let's just keep it as NASA. It's the space agency. Let's not mess with that. It works. Everybody loves the meatball logo.
It's known worldwide. The acronym NASA is just it's something that people in nearly every country understand.
Yeah, I mean, you could go to remote parts anywhere in the world, and I'm sure they've heard of NASA, and I'm sure they've heard of the moon landings. I mean, these are things that it's almost synonymous with modern life that you have to know what NASA is. It's got such good branding. To throw that out the window just makes no sense to me. But so
I thought you'd enjoy the moon part of that quote.
Oh, I will talk about the moon later. I will talk about my quandary with the moon. But so sort of back up a little bit to the Space Council. Something that you mentioned is very important, in that in this reorganization of the offices of space policy and sort of centralizing everything in a Space Council, it really personalizes, I guess, our space program. In the last 24 years since the last Space Council, with the various iterations of whatever was happening under Clinton, Bush, and Obama, space exploration was always kind of it was a line item on the budget. It didn't really, unless the president was very active, and there are many examples of President Bush being very active in the space program, and President Obama as well, of being very active in the space program and knowing what's going on. There's not really a sense of what these programs are doing and the progress that they're making and how important maintaining certain funding levels is. So what the Space Council is going to allow us to do as advocates is say, these are programs that are they're direct. It's a direct line to the vice president, who is, has the ear of the president, who ultimately signs budgets into law. I mean, he doesn't create the budget, but having that,
No, never mind.
but having that weight of the vice president saying the vice president's behind us on this one, like that adds a lot of weight in Washington. It's a bit, I don't want to say archaic, but I mean, it's sort of just how the process has always gone. I mean, people try to innovate on processes all the time, but this is something that, it's constitutionally, obligated to. They're obligated to create a budget every year, or pay for things every year. I don't know. The budget process is kind of crazy right now. I'm sure us in the future listening back on this are gonna, be very, very concerned for our mental sanity with what's going on in Washington. But having the line directly to the vice president is very important. So I'm excited to see where the Space Council goes. Hopefully it goes well. Maybe last thing for Washington. We've been on this for a bit. The House Science Committee had a hearing on the ISS after 2024. It's in the budget. NASA will be spending money on maintaining the ISS up through 2024. After that, it is completely uncertain. We have no idea what's going on, and everyone's scared. So the House Science Committee had a hearing on this. They had a bunch of experts come on from the commercial side, the civilian side, the intelligence side, the technology side, sort of all talking about what benefits we can still squeeze out of the ISS. So Newton, maybe you want to talk a little bit about maybe some technology or like what's the purpose of the ISS after 2024?
So a couple of things that the ISS is still used for. This isn't necessarily after 2024, but to kind of give you an example, there are still NASA missions that send instruments up to the ISS to do Earth sciences research. We mentioned a couple of these. A couple of these in the last episode's podcast, but there are certain. It still serves as a great platform for conducting for having humans conduct experiments in space, as far as being able to not have to use robotics technologies for necessarily everything. So tons of experiments are run on ISS. Experiments that require things like zero gravity, from medical experiments to testing out new electronics. Things like that actually would be critical for future NASA missions, as well as Earth science missions, like I mentioned before. Testing out certain capabilities for the mission to Mars could require just simply having astronauts still on the space station, but just testing out those new capabilities, using it as a platform. But the other thing that it permits us, and Jack, you and I have talked about this before, is the ISS truly is a symbol of international cooperation. It's us working with astronauts and cosmonauts from all over the globe. I would be disappointed to see the ISS go away. However, if it is the plan for them to replace it with something new and different, or if they have a route, and I think this is far from possible for a commercial organization to help either replace it or maintain it, I think that would be a great. That would be an outstanding option.
That's something that they talked about in this, and that was a main point, was using. We've used the ISS previously and continually as a proving ground for developments in space technology, and especially in the area of human health in space.
There's so many things that need to be tested if we are going to conduct a long-term mission anywhere. If it's the moon, if it's Mars, obviously we didn't there we had a limited number of tests that we could run the last time that we went to the moon, but actually being prepared, and being prepared to conduct experiments, there's nothing like doing it in an environment that is effectively close to what you're to the area that you're going to be in. So doing things like, for instance, there's all this talk about 3D printing when we're on these missions to both Mars and the moon, using 3D printing technologies to print tools on the fly as needed for either conducting day-to-day operation or for running specialized experiments. Now, yes, we can conduct many of those experiments in specialized labs here and in specialized chambers, but it would be easier to conduct those missions in an environment that's already, it's already prepared for those kinds of tests. It might actually cost even more effectively if we were to send something up just to execute those kinds of tests. There are capabilities down here for doing significant testing as if you were actually in space, but there's no better proving ground than actually being
Yeah,
up
I mean
there, being in space.
it's our current proving ground, and it's safe. As safe
Yeah.
as space can
Well,
get. Something
go
that
on.
is a huge concern in space is
Yeah.
radiation exposure, which
Right.
once you're outside of the Earth's magnetosphere, like you get pretty heavy doses of radiation. The ISS, thankfully, is sheltered from a lot of that by still being within most of the Earth's magnetosphere. So, I mean, you're seeing,
You still get hit with a
yeah. I mean,
decent
it's
amount of
still way
radiation,
more
but
than you would on the
yeah,
surface, but it's a good proving ground that you can spend a year and a half, 2 years up there, and not really have to worry about side effects immediately. I mean,
right.
they just did the year in space with Scott Kelly,
Right.
comparing himself to his brother Mark, for how the human body changes over that time. But we'll also be able to take readings on him on how the radiation dosages have affected him. And so far, it seems he's about as healthy as he was when he left. I mean, there have been
Yeah.
changes. We can certainly go further into that if either of us had medical degrees. But I mean, there are some pretty significant changes that have happened to him. But radiation dosage
It's
isn't.
it's hard to correlate those with with how much of it is the radiation from space, or things like, obviously there are things that we know are going to happen, right? Bone density loss,
Yeah,
for instance, that's just going to happen with you being in space. But there are certain other things that have been observed, that have happened to him, that it's very hard to correlate that, because now you have a sample of one person doing
yeah. Well,
that,
you
right?
have his brother. You have
compared
Mark,
to
who they're comparing him
compared to
to.
his brother. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but so the ISS is also can be a proving ground, and has so far been a great proving ground for commercial entities. I mean, we all know SpaceX and Orbital ATK, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, all developing capsules or cargo modules, sending up stuff up there.
All right.
But one of the things that happened last year, which was really interesting to me, was when Bigelow sent up their, I think it was the B 330 or something. They sent up a capsule or a module up there that attached
Yeah.
to,
Yeah. The expandable space
yeah, that
habitat.
attached
Yeah.
to the side of the ISS and deployed and filled up with air. And I mean, it's a
Yeah.
collapsible, more or less, structure that is. I mean, that could revolutionize the journey
Yeah.
to Mars as well, or journey to Moon, whatever it
Amazing
is.
tests like these can be run, but I understand the desire to potentially shut it down after 2024, but there would need to be a replacement, or a replacement ready. And I know our Congress really isn't too keen on pulling something back without being able to replace it. But this might be the one case that that they should have something in store for that. And what's the international community saying about this, as far as the U.S. potentially, if the U.S. were to potentially
Yeah.
pull out.
So they didn't really have much of an international perspective at the hearing. One of I can't remember which member it was, but one of the members, uh, we'll link the whole panel in the description. But one of the members of Congress asked, how are our commercial or international partners thinking about this? And I mean, Europe and Japan and Russia all have, and Canada all have either modules or components on the space
Right.
station. So I mean, it is truly an international effort that put this thing up there and keeps it up there, and maintains the high standard of living ISS astronauts have.
Right.
But the international community,
NASA's always had a big chunk of it,
over
though.
fifty
Like, even
percent,
just
yeah,
looking at, even looking at the hardware allocation for ISS hardware, NASA's always had an over 50%
yeah.
chunk.
So, and that makes sense because NASA is the most well-funded space program in the world. I mean, not
Right.
many other space programs can say that they're, you know, over $19 billion per year. Maybe $19 billion in a decade, but not in a year.
Right.
So the ISS sort of is this, it's mainly NASA, but it is also a beacon of international cooperation, of hope for future cooperation for the rest of the world. I mean, ESA is fully committed to it. Also looking to the moon, Russia is committed to it. They're actually going to be setting up a module. Eventually, it apparently had some problems. You can read up on that. But there's problems with the development of their second mod, or not second, their new module that they're sending up there. Japan has been sending stuff up there as well. I mean, it's
Yeah.
using the ISS as sort of the branching off point for international cooperation is integral to our future in space. I mean, it's a hallmark success story for international cooperation in space, and I think maintaining it up there through 2024 and then scaling back NASA's commitment and replacing that commitment with either commercial partners or future international partners. With the UAE is developing a space program. China is developing their own space station, so we don't have to worry about them.
Although they've expressed interest in participation.
Yeah, I mean, it could very well be a great bonding experience between our space programs. I mean, we saw this with after the Cold War ended with Russia, us engaging them in 1997 to become part of the ISS. Not only save the ISS in the first place, but it developed this relationship that we had with Russia and continue to have with Russia, this goodwill, if you could call it that, in space. Anything could be happening on the ground, terrestrially, conflict, political, espionage, what have you. But the space programs, NASA and the Russian space program, work very well together and have shared data and shared vehicles and shared ideas. So using the ISS as a jumping off point for future endeavors in international space, I think is the right way to go.
And either way, it would have to come full circle if we intend to, for instance, deorbit it. One of the last reports that I read, and this was a little while ago, about a year or two ago, and this may have changed, stated that the technical feasibility of an actual controlled, targeted deorbit into a remote ocean was found to be possible only with the assistance of the Russians.
Yeah.
So either way, we'd have to cooperate to get this thing down in a
So the
targeted
Russians
way.
could be like, no, always keep it up there. And we have to keep it up there because we can't, because you don't want that thing falling down on some Brazilian village or
Right.
something. It's a big hunk of metal with a lot of components and dangerous things on there.
Yeah, NASA currently has no spacecraft capable of deorbiting
Yeah.
the ISS,
Um,
as far as I
so you know,
and I'll look it up if and throw it in the show notes if anything's different.
um, but so there's another idea for the ISS that was sort of touched on in the hearing, but they didn't really talk too much about it. A lot of people like the idea of keeping it international and keeping it up there. Of the idea is to break it apart into its constituent parts and have an American space station, a Canadian space station, Japanese space station, all based on those different parts. But I just feel like that's
This is the sound of me rolling my eyes. Ready, ladies and gentlemen?
that
All
was
right,
the
go on,
biggest
Dad.
eye roll I've ever seen. Um, but I mean that is one idea that's being tossed around. But really,
You're gonna spend the money
yeah,
to operate multiple different
I'm not saying it's a
ISSs.
good idea, Newton. I'm just saying it's an
All
idea
right.
that's out there.
Okay.
But I think the main idea is keeping it up there, transferring power and control of it over from primarily NASA to commercial entities and to other international partners. I mean, because I mean, it's the ISS. It could stay up there forever. It's space. It's not really gonna, it's not gonna rust. But it is getting old, and staying in
Yeah.
low Earth orbit isn't necessarily where we want to be for the next 40, 50 years. I mean, we do want to move beyond that. So I do
Right.
agree that transitioning some of that funding after 2024 from the ISS to other programs, especially if they're Mars driven, is very important.
Yeah, and I've actually seen a couple of ideas, and obviously these are in the pre-design stage, even at the but I've even seen this, for instance, at the DARPA Wait What forum, a giant showcase that DARPA put on a couple years back. Just thoughts, notions of the potential for what effectively is a manufacturing facility that would be placed in geosync. Now, if we wanted to dump ISS and to be able to afford that, I'm here for
Well,
it.
people have been saying manufacturing things in space will make space profitable for decades. I mean, that was one of the original
Right,
ideas
right.
behind the ISS back when it was Space Station Freedom.
Yeah.
Was that it would be
But
a
I think with the new age,
manufacturing.
I think what's really pushing it now is the new age of 3D printing, the ability to very accurately and very precisely create create tools and system components based off precise specifications. I think manufacturing has changed significantly because of it. So it may be more technologically feasible at this point. Well, or more technologically useful
Yeah.
to do so.
Um, so I think we talked about the ISS. We're still on our first segment, everybody. We're still on This Week in Washington. It was a busy week. So let's move on to our space news highlight of the week. SpaceX.
SpaceX. um,
I just want everyone to know that we said that at the exact same time, and there was no editing done about that. Like, we said that at the exact same time.
So there is something big that's happening on Thursday. And I'm talking about March 30th.
8:30 p.m.
Something that could change the history of space flight, or at least rocketry forever. It's at least a milestone, and that would be the launch of the first ever reused rocket in for to deliver a payload to low Earth orbit. On Thursday, SpaceX will attempt to launch a Falcon 9 rocket containing an SES-10. Those are those Eurosat. I'm sorry, Eurostar communications satellites from Launchpad 39. We've talked about the Falcon 9 rocket before. I won't hammer that point home again.
But this is true
But I mean,
reusability.
this is incredible. This is honestly, it is a milestone. I'm reading an article here that's saying how this is the Wright brothers moment for SpaceX, and this is the moment that could change things forever. It kind of feels a bit underwhelming in that we've been expecting it and waiting for it so long. And I mean, in my eyes, I kind of viewed it as an eventuality, like they would engineer their way there.
Or someone would.
But
Someone would eventually
yeah,
get to that
someone would.
point.
Yeah, right. But it's exciting to actually see that here it is. It's gonna
Yeah.
happen. So someone's actually gonna take a rocket that's been used before and use it again. And it's, as we talked about a little bit last week. It's good to see that you know while this is happening, SpaceX will get credit for being the first, but there's already sort of this competitive market for doing it. Like this is really where you start to get innovation in the private sector. Is when one billionaire sees someone doing something incredible like this, another billionaire like Jeff Bezos comes along and says, "Oh, I'm going to do it too with the New Glenn rocket." Yeah, I mean, this
Yeah.
is it's
So before
outstanding. So
the Blue Origin fanboys, which I don't have a catchy name for them yet, like muskrats for SpaceX fans, but before the Blue Origin fan people get all hot and bothered about this, Blue Origin has launched the same rocket 5 times and landed it successfully and launched it again and again and again and again. But this is the first time this has been done orbitally. SpaceX tried
right,
this
right, yeah,
last September, and it blew up on the launch pad. SpaceX has been trying to do this. I mean, this is 15 years in the making. This is what SpaceX was like Elon Musk was set out to do in 2002. Like he wanted this to be an eventuality, and we're almost there. I mean, we're not on his timetable, but we're almost there. We're at this point. We're developing the capability to launch the first stage of a rocket, which is arguably one of the most intricate and difficult parts to launch and design, or design and launch, and being able to land it and then launch it again and then land it again, like that could be
right. Their goal is rapid reusability, and like you said, and I misspoke earlier, but it's to get things into at least LEO using a rocket that we've used before. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, there's not a ton to say about this story. It represents a significant milestone in this particular mission, and it could lead to much cheaper things like resupply missions to the International Space Station, even though SpaceX already has a 1.6 billion contract, 1.6
hey,
billion
but
dollar contract in place
when it
with NASA to do
transitions over
so.
to an entirely commercial, when it's the Bigelow
Right, right.
casino and hotel space station, SpaceX will be able to ferry people up there a lot more efficiently.
It's true.
Flights
It's
on
true.
the it won't be Pan American, it'll be SpaceX for all you 2001 A Space
So
Odyssey
yeah.
fans out there. But yeah, I mean, this is, as of recording this at 10 p.m. on March 27th, 2017. The flight is scheduled for 8:30 p.m. on the 30th of March. So be sure to follow us on Twitter as we watch that. I'm just going to zone in on that. I don't care what else I'm doing. I'm going to zone in on this launch and live tweet it, because that's where we're at as a society, and also because like that's probably the best way to really kind of keep up to date on this news.
I mean, and you're capturing true
Yeah, I mean
history.
this
This isn't
is
you live tweeting your lunch.
yeah.
This is
I'm having a salad, and no, this is we're
right.
talking about if Orville Wright had a Twitter account, he would have been tweeting at Kitty Hawk.
God.
Like this is that type of moment. So let's go international. Let's go in international waters.
Let's go
The Ariane
international. So
5.
there's been a Right. There's been quite a bit of talk over the last week about a general strike that's that has actually delayed um that is threatening to delay an actual launch in French Guiana. Um, French Guiana faced a strike Monday over crime and economic difficulties amid protests that have paralyzed the French territory, and it's halted flights and a rocket launch and prompted an actual U.S. travel warning. So for those that don't remember, this is actually one of the locations where we're going to be even launching the James Webb telescope out of. So the French government has sent an emergency mission to try to quell tensions in the territory I mean, that territory contains about a quarter million people. Um, and there are protests that are blocking the roads to neighboring countries like Brazil and Suriname. Um, it looks like quite a mess, but there are articles that are being as extreme to say, oh, how is this going to affect the James Webb telescope and things like that. These it's highly unlikely that these protests will last all the way all the way into next year. That's
Late
or
next year
even
too.
in the next five,
I mean, a
yeah,
year and
late
a
next
half,
year.
I would say. I mean, so I would caution people of getting too upset. I mean, same with I guess last week when we were talking about China. Like, don't get too upset about things that are going on internationally. It might seem like there's a lot of uncertainty, which, as always, there is in space. But this one is going to pan out fine. Um,
Right. Yeah. So the just a little bit behind a little bit more about the actual protests. There's a group called the Collective of 500 Brothers, and they've been demanding that the French government send a minister to negotiate them, to negotiate with them. They were initially created to focus on fighting crime, um, and it just seems like the social and racial divides within France. I'm sorry, within the colonies of France and France itself are really promoting this. So this is it's a dispute that hopefully will be resolved, within the next, it could be 2 to 3 months that it takes to completely quell this dispute. But like I said, there's not really much of a worry about afterwards. Which launch specifically was being halted? I think it was DoD,
yeah,
but I don't have it in front of me.
I'm not seeing anything to. I mean, it's another Ariane 5 launch, which they're still. I mean, they have to make sure that they keep up with launching these things so that in a year and a half, they're still going to have the technical know-how to, if there is a problem and the James Webb is sitting on top, that they know how to fix it. Not
Right.
losing any of that technical ability is very important for Ariane Space. Um, but I don't know, did you look up what sort of satellite's going to be on there or what the launch is?
I'm seeing Korea Sat and SGDC one that were originally canceled. These look like, yeah, a telephone communication satellites. But these aren't
Yeah.
US based. We'll include them in the
Yeah.
show notes.
So there's money in space and it's all in telecommunications.
Yeah.
So that I mean you'll notice that a lot of these launches. I mean the launch on Thursday with SpaceX is a communication satellite. Um, but yeah, I mean this should not affect James Webb. So you
Right.
had some
Right.
information about World Water Day.
So World Water Day. So World Water Day, for folks who don't know, is actually celebrated on March 22nd every year, and it focuses on the theme of wastewater. So this is us getting into our, kind of diving into the last story of our international segment, and this will probably spilled over into latest in tech. ESA celebrated World Water Day by sending out a great image from their Sentinel 2A satellite as it was above Luzon in the Philippines, with part of the city of Manila captured in the image. The reason this is in, well, first of all, the image was actually taken last May 2016. In the actual image, you see a difference in color between the dark Manila Bay on the left and lighter Laguna de Bay in the center. I'll make sure to include the image also in the show notes. You're gonna have a lot of show notes this week. The important part to this, though, is that the image shows black plumes of water pollution visible at the outlets of two rivers, the Taguig and Pasig rivers. Manila Bay has been called a pollution hotspot for the longest time. There's a ton of pollution in the water caused by sewage, pesticides, fertilizers, and industrial charges, as well as pollution from oil spills. This is this is what happens when you don't regulate what you can dump. So this was kind of to some extent this was ESA's way of saying, you want to see an unregulated future, because here's an unregulated future. And this brings me to the point that's actually going to spill over a bit into the latest in tech. So we'll just dive right in it. We've been talking quite a bit about US's Earth Sciences program just because they're at risk, and talking about how critical they are because other people get data from us. Other countries tend to use our data, use the devices on our instruments, as we use the devices on other countries' instruments in order to perform Earth sciences, study things like climate change, study things like ecological systems. We use that type of Earth sciences data for all sorts of things. And we should be protecting our Earth sciences programs for a million reasons, including it is detrimental to health, safety, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, you've heard me preach about that before.
Oh, have I?
Yeah. But ESA really does have an amazing Earth sciences thrust, which has lately been highlighted, particularly through a program that they have called Copernicus. And I really wanted to highlight that this week. They make the claim on their website, and this appears to be true, that Copernicus is the most ambitious Earth observation program to date. So as one full program, I could see how they could justify that, because and you'll hear in a second why I think that's the case. The goal of the program is to provide accurate, timely, and easily accessible information to improve the management of the environment, understand and mitigate the effects of climate change, and for security purposes. It's actually headed by the European Commission in partnership with the European Space Agency, so it has very high visibility. No pun intended.
One could say mile high. Well, maybe 100 mile
visibility.
high.
Maybe, yeah, I was going to say a little higher than that. So getting into it, a part of the Copernicus mission is pulling down data from upwards 30 satellites is what they plan on launching to accomplish its mission goals. Each Sentinel mission, which is what sort of these constellations of satellites are called, but each is based on a constellation of two satellites. So they'll have, for instance, Sentinel 1, which will be orbiting one way. Sentinel 1A, which will be orbiting one way, and Sentinel 1B, which will be orbiting the other way. And the idea is to fulfill revisit and coverage requirements, providing extremely robust data sets that can be used for Earth sciences. They, like I said, they call these constellations Sentinels, and they each have a number of capabilities that contribute to land, ocean, and atmospheric monitoring. And I'm just going to briefly touch on each one of them. There are 6. There have been 3 missions that have now been fully launched, and actually, and three more to go. Um, Sentinel-1 consists of two polar orbiting satellites. 1A was launched back in April 2014, and 1B was launched in April 2016. It's a polar orbiting, all-weather, day and night radar imaging mission for land ocean services. Um, the Sentinel-1 mission includes what's called C-band imaging, and this just describes imaging a portion of the electromagnetic spectrum in the microwave range of frequencies ranging from 4 to 8 gigahertz. It will operate in four exclusive imaging modes with different resolution down to 5 meters and coverage up to 400 kilometers. It provides dual polarization capability, very short revisit times, and rapid data delivery. And for each observation, it provides really extremely precise measurements of spacecraft positions and altitude. Sentinel 2 2A was launched in June 2015, and 2B launched recently on March 7th of this year. This is part of why I brought this up, because we didn't really cover it last week in the China, Russia, and North Korea hour. It will so Sentinel 2 will deliver high resolution optical images for land surfaces. Specifically, it will monitor variability in land surface conditions and will support monitoring of changes to vegetation within the growing season. And it does this through what's called multispectral imaging. I don't want to dive too into the weeds here, but it'll be able to sample 13 spectral bands. And basically, so basically, multispectral imaging just captures image data at specific frequencies across the electromagnetic spectrum. It pulls all of that data together, looking at light both in the visible range and not in the visible range. And looking and peering at the Earth at varying ranges at varying frequencies allows you to see different things. For instance, the spectral bands have different applications for different kinds of imaging. The blue spectral band is for atmospheric and deep water imaging up to 150 feet deep in clear water. The green is for imaging vegetation and deep water structures up to 90 feet deep in clear water. And red is for imaging man-made options in water up to 30 feet deep, soil and vegetation. And then there's a series of infrared bands that are typically used for imaging vegetation, soil, moisture, geological features, forest fires, things like that. And thermal infrared, which folks are familiar with when it comes to night vision, which images geological structures, so thermal differences in water currents and fires, and for nighttime studies. That's Sentinel-2, and that constellation is now launched. They're actually capturing images and seeing really interesting information about geological landscapes on Earth, and you'll see more pictures coming out of ESA regarding that. I'm just going to briefly hit the next four missions. Given that they aren't completely launched, there's one satellite up for Sentinel-3A. That was launched in February of last year. Sentinel-3's main goal is marine observation. It's meant to measure sea surface topography, sea and land surface temperature, ocean color, and land color with high accuracy. The satellite is going to be operated by EUMETSAT. That's basically Europe's version of NOAA. They monitor, climate and meteorological changes, things like that. So that's Sentinel-3. Sentinel-4. The Sentinel-4 focuses on monitoring trace gas concentrations and aerosols in the atmosphere, and it's extremely focused on air quality and being able to assess air quality for near real time applications. Sentinel-4 will sit in geosynchronous orbit. Sentinel-5 and 5 precursor is what they're calling it. Those will monitor air quality at low Earth orbit, and will coordinate with Sentinel-4 in order to get sort of a concise picture of air quality data. And Sentinel-6, which is very far away. Carries a radar altimeter to measure global sea surface height, primarily for operational oceanography and for climate studies. So I just really wanted to highlight those. Specifically because we didn't get to those last week. But this is ESA making a giant thrust into Earth sciences, which at a time where the U.S. may not be doing that for very much longer. It's good to know that these programs are going
I
to
mean,
be up and
that
running.
sounds incredibly ambitious. I mean, like I
Yeah,
maybe understood
yeah,
half the words of all the science stuff that you talked about. But I mean, that is extremely important stuff. I mean, that is
yeah.
maintaining 24-hour Earth sensing, like
Earth
knowing
observation.
knowing what's going on in so many different areas, in so many different ways, so many different issues, uh, all at the same time. All right, so this new segment, our last segment after our discussion in technology, our last segment for the day is listener submitted queries, which we're taking listener submitted suggestions for what we should call this section. Um, our suggestion of a topic comes from our producer, Tom Kelly, and he asks, "What is my deal with the moon people, the lunatics? Why do I call them lunatics?" And we sort of alluded to it earlier, talking about moon versus Mars. Um, as you can also see, we're running a little bit up to past an hour at this point. So I'm only going to touch on this very briefly. So the moon versus Mars debate has sort of been raging under the radar for quite a while. I mean, I got involved with space stuff in 2013, and even starting around then, I could see sort of this animosity between the lunar people and the Mars people. The main question here is, for the next big endeavor in human space exploration, where do we go? We've already done low Earth orbit. That's being taken care of, and it's being transitioned over to international partners in the commercial sector. Do we go on to Mars, which has been a long-standing goal? I mean, even as far back as von Braun was talking about this with the Mars project, sending people to Mars. Granted, he was a bit more extravagant in his mission architecture. But I mean, this is something people have been talking about, is like, it's not the moon. The moon isn't a planet in our current definition. But the next closest planet that is habitable in some respect is Mars, because we can't really go to Venus. So the question is, do we?
That's not forward thinking enough, Jack.
Yeah, let's just go to Europa. Let's go to Pluto with people. Take 9 years to get there. But so Mars is the next planet, with the moon being the closest celestial object that's bigger than an asteroid and actually has gravitational pull. So the big problem I have with the lunatics, which is, as much as it, I love SpaceX. I'm a fan of SpaceX, but I'm not a muskrat. I love the moon. It's great, but I'm not a lunatic. I don't think that it's moon before everything else. But there are people out there, and I'm sure there are those that can debate me on this. But there are definitely those that can't, that the moon is the logical next step going forward, because it's closer than Mars. We've been there before. There's resources we can utilize on the moon. It can be another proving ground. And all those points are valid. I do accept those as valid. But if we choose the moon, I think it was Grunsfeld, John Grunsfeld, former astronaut and former head of NASA's Science Mission Directorate, said, "I fear a little bit that if we want to go to Mars, but we decide to go to the moon first, we'll be there for 20 or 30 years. And that's exactly what happened with low Earth orbit. We can't, as a society, stay only for 10 years somewhere. Like, I mean, when we went to low Earth orbit for the first time, we're like, oh, we'll go to the moon next, and then we'll go on to Mars, and by the year 2000, we'll have colonized half the solar system. Well, that didn't happen. We went to the moon 6 times, and then we stayed in low Earth orbit for 40 years. the same thing could happen on the moon. I mean, as we drive costs down of sending things to space and sending things beyond low Earth orbit, beyond the Earth orbit, going into cislunar space, or to trans-Martian space, we're gonna find that, like, oh, I guess we could stay at the moon for another 5 years. Oh, I guess we could do this for another 10 years. I mean, this path dependency that we're gonna develop as we did with low Earth orbit. So I'm gonna say, if we're gonna go anywhere, let's go to Mars. I'm a firm believer. I mean, I'm with, and a lot of people on this, all the best people know that Mars is where you want to go. But I mean, it's also the consensus of the scientific community that, I mean, we could go to Mars or go to the moon, and there could be some great science that we do there. But it's nothing compared to what we're going to be able to do on Mars. I mean, the amount of research that we're going to be able to pursue on the Martian surface far exceeds the amount of research we can do on the lunar surface. I mean, obviously we can find things to look at. There's always a new rock in space to look at. But Mars is so much more promising scientifically. We're going to link in the description of this podcast in the show notes an article by Jeff Faust, writer for Space News and also key contributor to the Space Review. He is in charge of most of it. And he writes he writes an article, A Gateway to Mars or the Moon, talking about sort of where we stand with this new authorization bill and what the future might hold for Mars or Moon. And I definitely want to have more of this conversation. And especially if we can get someone on who is either a lunatic or pro-moon. I can think of a few people because there are merits to it. But the people who say we should go there for nostalgia's sake or say we're going to mine helium-3, we could, but that's going to be such a longer time commitment and going to delay Mars, I mean, by decades, if not generations.
I don't see a benefit out of the mining helium-3 discussion, at least not one significant to justify a mission to the moon. And I'm not convinced that we would do something like that for nostalgia's sake. My concern is the economic cost, right? Now, granted, it's not going to be cheap to get to Mars either. But if you have to pick one to spend your money on, I would honestly pick somewhere where that you've never sent humans to before, and where we could do, quite frankly, better science. It would cost in 2017 dollars. It cost,
Hit me with the budget.
It would cost $711 million to build the Saturn V that got us to the moon. Now, do we have slightly better capabilities? Would something like potentially even the Falcon Heavy or something like that take us there? Sure, and they could potentially do it for cheaper, but that's a massive, that kind of number is a massive expense to go somewhere out of straightforward nostalgia.
Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying is the lunatics they're so stuck in this. Well, like my parents' generation got to go to the moon. I want to go to the moon. It's everybody who was raised post Apollo saw that as like that's the pinnacle of scientific achievement, of human exploration. And I mean, in a sense it was, but to say that's as far as we can go and we should only go that far, no, we should go to Mars. I mean,
well, they're not, and God, in defense of the lunatics, I'm sorry, but they're saying that we should view it as a stepping stone, but that's way more than the United States is willing to invest in space.
I mean, if we gave the DoD budget to NASA, I mean, we could be on Europa.
Right. Yeah. Do both.
Do everything.
Go all over the solar system at this point. But that's just not what NASA has in it. NASA has to do so many studies. NASA has to continue to do Earth science. NASA has to do planetary science. NASA has to do basic research in astrophysics, things like that. if we're gonna have to pick one, it probably shouldn't be the
Yeah.
moon where we've been for. There's a lot to discover on the moon. Okay, I don't want to. I don't, I don't want to annoy lunar scientists who are actually studying the moon and studying its makeup and
Well,
would
that's what I'm
love to
saying.
have
Like
us
their
go
points are
there.
valid that the moon has a
But
lot to offer. It's just with as limited a budget as NASA has, the moon just doesn't make sense. I mean, if you say that it's
right, we've never been to to another
yeah.
planet. There's so much scientific discovery, depending on your definition of
Also,
a planet.
let's just say that if we go to Mars, there's a higher probability that we're going to find life there, and that's just going to be world change, universe changing. But that's a different
I'm a
argument.
little
That's a
skeptical
different
on that
argument.
one, but yeah, okay.
So something that I wanted to bring up about this though is that NASA has already sort of started to work towards developing capabilities to either do Moon or Mars. So there are very vast differences in getting to Moon and Mars, and a lot of that has to do with entry, descent, and landing, which we have not developed a system for either the Moon or Mars to work with the Orion capsule or SLS. But the last year, 6 companies were awarded varying amounts of funds on the order of, a couple, I mean, just like handful of millions of dollars. That's a lot of money, but like handfuls of millions of dollars in the next step, which is Next Space Technologies for Exploration Partnerships contract. And these 6 companies were tasked with sort of developing prototypes of a habitat for deep space exploration. So that could be the module or set of modules that they send around the moon or to Mars or wherever. So NASA is moving forward very cautiously, knowing that at the drop of a pin, Congress could say, all right, we're doing moon, or, oh, we're doing Mars. Oh, we're doing Mars. Oh, never mind, we're doing moon. So developing these capabilities, this capabilities driven approach where we develop the tools first, pick the mission later, which seems to be, in my opinion, pretty smart on their part, because then it doesn't mean that if we switch from one mission to another or back and forth, that it's really going to create too much turmoil in developing these technologies.
Well, I agree with creating as many general purpose or tailorable technologies as possible. But you can find yourself that you've effectively dug a hole for yourself if you end up building all of these capabilities to do either, and then having this to spend having to pay a high cost to tailor it to one or the other. My hope is that you would invent technologies or create technologies or engineer new capabilities that could execute one mission and then generalize it to multiple missions. That way, you reduce a significant amount of the experiment costs. But
Yeah.
that's for another show.
Yeah,
We're
I mean,
running out of time.
yeah, we are running out of
Yeah.
time, but yeah, Tom, that is our answer to your query. We're going to talk a lot more about Moon versus Mars. It's getting to that point where Congress needs to decide, and thankfully, with the authorization, they do mention Mars in 2033 as sort of this hazy goal in the distance. But again, things can change in Washington very quickly. That's where all the key decisions are made. So the last thing I wanted to bring up was coming soon to space. This podcast is going to launch on Wednesday, the 29th. So if you're listening to this and you don't have anything going on later today, there's a public lecture on Europa at the National Academies of Sciences. They're building on Constitution Avenue over by the State Department, talking about Europa. They have it's a public lecture. Anyone's free to attend. The Eventbrite information's in the show notes. And Dr. Kevin Hand, will be giving explaining the science behind Europa and the science that we could do there, as well as the search for life. So yeah, I guess that's everything I got. Unless you got anything else, Newton.
I've got nothing else. So I think that's
All right.
good for the
Well,
week.
as always, I'm Jack.
I'm Newton.
Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at @AdAstraPodcast. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to our mailing list. Rate us on iTunes, Google Play, all the various places that you download us from. Make sure you rate us and give us good reviews.
5 stars for everything.
5 stars for 4.5.
5 stars,
Even if you hate us. Even if you're a lunatic
Yeah.
or a muskrat. All of our favorite people. So yeah, that's it for today, everybody.
Ad
Ad
Astra.
Astra.